Yes. Leave it at this angle just because I have all of the scriptures. Last week, for those of you just to catch up, I'm not going to go through everything, but
We listened to
you
it
listen to it
today.
good. So
Yeah.
you got a little bit of Advent if you haven't listened to it. If you're just joining us, you go back to listen to the other if you didn't get the first part. A little bit of Advent, a little bit of Jesse Tree background, and we made it up through Noah. And we're not going to go back through those. And last week, on our Jesse Tree devotional. And again, if you guys don't have these are available online in past seasons. These are you can take these if you want with you. These are the same ones we printed out last year, so it's just something about devotionals, but we didn't do those this year. But the scriptures that I did for those, I just took the whole scripture because a lot of times the scriptures are very specific, and I just decided to. That's the ones are they're the same.
Okay.
That just has the introduction on the front of it.
Got it. Okay.
I ripped them all in case you wanted to color it. I was going to bring out some crayons and pencils, but
Well, I think I'm gonna
um,
take one.
you should take one to color. You can color one right now if you want. You can do it.
Okay.
But last week we went through the creation account, and then we went through the fall the Paradise Garden, the fall, what happened there, the ark, and then we kind of ended, I believe, there. I don't think we did. You listened to it today, so we didn't go past.
Uh-uh.
We didn't go to no, and I think we stopped there. So what you have, and so today we'll look at these, and I printed out a couple different. There are all sorts of versions. Looking at just sort of for the shorter snippets to see which of the smaller sections that we could read rather than read the larger sections. I was just reminded about, and it just goes to show you throughout the history. I mean, this is, I think we said last, this is over 1,000 years old, and where you have these pictures and that sort of depict the stories. So you have all sorts of different breakdowns and stories. And one of them that I wanted to share with you, and I have done this in the past, we're not going to really look, you can look at it, but by Geraldine McCallran, I guess her name is. But we have read this book in our family since Judah was 6 or something. I don't know. It feels like forever, and we're reading it now. And so every day there's just a story, and it's basically a story of a little boy who goes into a church cathedral and has great illustrations and talks to this old man. Here's the little boy and the old man. And the old man's a grumpy making this wooden carving of the Jesse tree. And every day the boy comes back and gets drawn into the story. And the guy ends up, telling him. So you can take a look at this, and I'll pass it that way. But that, in my sort of rummaging around the Jesse tree, I have lots of Jesse tree things, books, resources, and by far that has been our family's favorite. And in fact, that one corresponds, the ordering of the Jesse tree corresponds with this because of the fact that we wanted one that we could do every year that corresponded with the book as we read it. So we read one of those every night,
So
essentially.
I've not heard of this before. So it's not a family tree per se. It's a tree that's telling the story of leading up to
So yeah,
who
so
Jesus.
you will have to after this. You should go back and listen to the history of the Jesse tree and some of the
Yeah,
that'll give
okay.
you more of it. But the short of it is, the Jesse tree comes out of the period of the church when they started. Once Christendom was established, Advent goes back to the 400s. I think the first written document was like 480 or something like that. I think it was 800, 1,000. There are some records of some sort of passage from the root. I think 800 they saw the root was in a painting, and so for about 1,200 years around this season during Advent, there have been people within the Western Church, maybe even the Eastern too, that used the symbols of Jesse tree, and this goes back to sprang from the root of Jesse. So when we sing O Come,
Mhm.
Emmanuel" this week and the next week, we'll sing one of the verses about the root of Jesse. And so it goes back to, and Jesse was David's father,
Mhm.
and that was the earth, and we'll get to that story and we'll come up to that, but that's where the sort of kingship was established that brought Christ onto the scene. So the Jesse tree is a way that every Advent season you can go from creation all the way up to Christ in the manger. And I have always loved it because it just gets my family every year gets to go through the stories and the narrative um, of of the whole story. So that, again, it's something I said, as I said on Sunday. I think it's something that we should know. I think it's something that we should be able to say, not just Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, we should be able to go through these and place these things. 2,000 years of history with just really about probably 30 significant events overall is not too much to really have some sense of ordering. So maybe one of these winters we'll start doing biblical trivia night, and we'll all gather around and have some beers and do biblical trivia. It'd be like pub trivia night, but it's at the church.
Yeah, very good.
Anyway, the stories really do walk you through the faithfulness of God. And really that's the kind of, and I don't think as we got started last week, I lost sight of the fact that I wanted to come back to the idea that in every single one of these stories, you see God's faithfulness. And so in that first story, creation, God's faithfulness not only of just creating in this majestic creation that God puts out into the earth, but providing for humanity, God's faithfulness of establishing this Adamic covenant with them and saying, hey, let's, dwelling in the garden on the seventh day, you see God's faithfulness. Even in the fall, it's not obliteration. God doesn't give up. God says, okay, you're not going to be able to participate in the garden anymore, but we're going to send you out and I'll still dwell with you. And there's still interaction. You see Cain and Abel, you see that connection between God and humanity still, although a much more distant one. And then as sin occurs throughout the very beginning in the first few chapters of the Bible, and you do land yourself in Noah, then Noah is sort of, again, God saying, this isn't working out. I want to be faithful. I want to dig, and so he says, I'm going to start over. And I'm going to take just a cluster of people and we'll just reset the whole project and get it. So yes, everyone is a descendant in some regard from Noah. And regardless of whether you were a young earth creation as in 6,000 years, or evolutionary creation, it doesn't make a difference. Everyone would be a descendant of Noah. Unless God was doing something different on the other side of the earth and we just weren't aware of it, but I doubt that. So, but as the story goes, again, humans are unfaithful, and you get to a time where God is like, and this is where it leads us up to the story of Abraham, and I think that Abraham is significant in terms of covenantal theology, because you have God creates a covenant of grace with Adam and Eve, and then God creates the same covenant of grace with some stipulations, I guess, with Noah. And then with Abraham, you have the beginning of the Adamic covenant. And again, if these are things that are unfamiliar, this notion of covenant, it's something that we should, again, revisit again and again. What does it mean that God makes covenants with us? Because if you don't understand the first 5, 6 covenants that are in there, depending if you include Moses, then the new covenant just doesn't make as much sense. And then the very words of as we did on Sunday, the words of institution for communion are, this cup is not like the new covenant. This cup isn't a symbol of the new covenant. It's this cup is the new covenant. And that's the blood. And there's something very significant about all of that. And we've talked about that this past fall, about the blood and the significance of that in terms of Christ's priestly ministry. So today we pick it up, and I found a document after scouring the internet. I finally found one, a good Catholic resource, that it's not the New Revised Standard Version, but it is the Revised Standard Version, and it does give us most of these shorter passages, which will allow us to get through. So my hope is, what I'd love to get through is about 10 of them today, and then we'll just do these. Some of them will go faster than others, but let's go with Abraham. So we're starting in the story of Abraham. In ours here, it's represented as a camel. Others, it's represented in a tent. There are other ways that people have represented. I don't remember all the different symbols. What does this one say? No, it doesn't say here. But I'll go ahead and read. So it says this, the blessing of Abraham. Genesis 12, 1 through 3, verses, and 17:5. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those, and those who curse you I will curse, and by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Now, I'm happy just to riff on this, but when you hear that, what is your reaction? What do you hear? Is this a significant passage to you? Do you feel any sense of connection to it? Or is it just a story of some dude that started it all?
It says it's like God choosing a special people, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is, and I think it's a case of not just God choosing. God made the human race, and then God flooded it, and then God's like, let's start again with the human race, and then realized that that as nations developed and grew, and that's where the time between Noah and Abraham is probably much longer than people realize, in terms of the development of generations and tribes and nations. That means there are other nations being developed, and there are other people groups. So God is honing in on one person to develop a nation out of.
I always wondered whether Abraham's age and situation was a target of God, or did God have to look that hard to find a person of proper character, and it turned out to be Abraham, who was already past his prime.
Yeah. Maybe, and I think that in the same way of Sarah having a baby, God can do anything in terms of the genetics of that. But I think in terms of the character, maybe. I mean, I think that there are people who faith comes easier to than others. There is a genetic factor and a personality factor that plays into humanity. Some people are very kind people. Some people, it's very difficult for them to be kind. Some people are loud talkers. Some people are quiet talkers. There's a variety of everyone. So in some cases, I mean, what do you owe his blamelessness to? I don't know. Maybe that's, in some sense you would say, well, from a providential side, God created Abraham, but in a actual God intersecting with the narrative of human history, God recognized something different about Abraham.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, is why Abraham?
If I had to just take a wild stab, I would say that his blamelessness is not about his capacity for sin or not sin, because I think everyone was fraught with it, but his God awareness, a sense of spirituality, a sense of this. What is faith? Faith is a belief in something that is not there. So there's a supernatural part of it. There's maybe even a superstitious, but there's something super that's over and against what we normally experience. And maybe for some people that comes much. There are very intuitive people. Sarah laughed and then, got in trouble. But Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as faith. So in some sense, there was nothing, I mean, yes, there was something special about him, but we don't fully understand that beyond what the text says itself. But what is significant about this text is this is really what starts it all. And what's important about it in terms of us as Gentiles after the fact are hearing it is it says, I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you, I will curse. And this is, this is our connection to Israel. But here's the real kicker. I should have gone up a little farther. And I will make a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. So the name, the nation, the sense of blessing that came upon Abraham was not for their own, but so that they could then be a blessing to others. And then it comes out again, I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you, I will curse. And by you, and Jews and Israelites, all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. So there will be a blessing that will extend far beyond. And so it's the first time God singles out someone to say, I'm going to commit to someone. Now, it's not always clear whether that's going to remain, whether, and this is Israel's plight for the rest of the story, is faithfulness, unfaithfulness to God, and the results that come from that. Okay, so that's Abraham. So now we get into the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We always talk about the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So we turn on and we go to Isaac. And in Isaac, in most of the passages, have something in relationship to Genesis 22. This is Genesis 22, 1 through 2, and 9 through 13. It cuts it up, but it's fine for our purposes. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I shall tell you. And when they came to the place God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Then Abraham put forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Without getting too deeply into that story, because I think that there are multiple ways that we can consider it, and I think some make it, we have accepted the narrative of sort of this is a precursor or a foreshadowing of God's own sacrifice of his son. And I think we as Christians who interpret the Christology, of the cross through this, I've shared on many occasions, I think there's also another way to look at it as many of the things they did. The reason Abraham had relations with Hagar and produced Ishmael was because he didn't trust God. And he was following the practice, obviously he had maidservants, and that was an accessible thing back then. And then there I have read some things that say, what if Abraham in his own psychology because this is what was going on in other nations around, decided to do this himself? Now that takes away that sort of the trauma of this abusive parent narrative. And that's really like, how could you do that? And I'll say this, I don't know. Like, it really doesn't make a difference to me. I think whether it happened or didn't happen, again, there are a lot of things that just in the end really don't matter. This is a passage, though, that is difficult for some to think, what type of God would require that? If you've already named him blameless, if you've already named him as, credited him faith.
Well, I guess he was testing him still.
Yes, but then we also say, Christ said himself, lead us not into temptation. And there are some that say, God, don't tempt us.
Well, and the fact that he's going to do it, he's going to kill
Well, yeah,
the
well, but
child.
here's the thing, is it would have been very common then. And part of that lens that you look
Kill your
through,
child?
yeah, I mean, really, children, here's the funny thing, is you say that it's because you're of the last century and a half. Children were looked at far more as assets to the community than they were to the family, than they were as precious little human individuals in the same way that we view them now. I mean, we cherish childhood, we elevate, we have don't get me started on the infantile nature of culture, or the infant fascination, or the child, youth fascination with youth that our culture has. But prior to the 1900s, children were there because you needed people to work the field. Mm-hmm. And you need someone to know that they would be there to take care of you. And you're likely to lose a bunch of children. So the value of children in biblical times was not what we even remotely imagine today.
Yeah, but to God, they should have been valued.
Well, I mean, yeah, but then if you go down that path, you're like, what about all the Egyptians' babies that were destroyed in the plague? What did they do?
I don't understand that.
Yeah.
I've never understood that. And I don't understand even sacrificing a poor ram. I don't understand the whole sacrifice.
Well, and that goes,
why God wanted that.
I don't necessarily know that, and this is something that I've been sort of tinkering with, is I don't know if that's necessarily, what if God acquiesced to a human understanding of atonement? In other words, Israelites weren't the only ones sacrificing. And in fact, I think that's a common response. I think if we don't live in the modern world, you look at the sun, you see it as a god. You look at the water, you see it as a power. You look at fire, you see it as something living. And you start to then think, these things have power over me. What can I do to appease them? And, so there's this, relationship that is created with the image of who the divine is. So, children were a dime a dozen. You just, they probably, a lot of them died. Death was more common. And so, the whole notion of sacrificing a child was already embedded in the idea of sacrifice, period. If other nations were doing it, this is the alternative article that I read, that God didn't ask. Abraham went forward. God was still, but here's the thing. Either way you look at the story, God is faithful. God is faithful by bringing a ram. God is faithful by saying, don't screw up, Abraham, this is your fault. Now, again, these are stories that were written thousands of years later and translated. So, unless you hold this perfect perfection view of Scripture, which you know that I don't, then these are things that have been morphed and changed and nuanced. I mean, there weren't vowels in, until the Masoretic scribes came in and put them in. So there's a lot of things that are just that you sort of have to take, both hold a literal value and a literal representation, but loosely with almost a symbolic or metaphorical understanding. I do believe in literal Adams and Eves. Do I think that they're the literal that I think they are based on the scriptures that I have? No. I think that would be, and that would be so self-congratulatory on my own theological prowess to say that I would have even remote understanding of what position. Now I noodle around with that, as we all do, but that's what, as long as we do with a sense of humility and deference. So anyway, but the point of it, again, God's faithfulness. So, and then you have obviously Abraham, Isaac. Isaac carries on, and Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob, and that's the whole story of the birthright and the trading of the. I love those stories. I think there's a lot of richness to them. I think but the trading of the stew for birthright and the trickery. And this is a case you want to talk about God using things that are challenging. I mean, Jacob was a sly one. I mean, he was grabbing on, he grabbed onto his older brother. He tricked his brother. He lied to his father. He, colluded with his mother. There's nothing good about Jacob, but that's who God chose. And this is a passage that points to the faithfulness of God's, even though we don't understand why God worked in the way God did around the Esau Jacob passage, it still is there. But that's not usually the passage that is drawn to that they lift up around Jacob, though. Isaac, Jacob, where is it? You know what? I don't have that one. Genesis 25. Give me 1 second here. Genesis 25 NRSV. 1 through 34. Those are the birth narratives. Sorry, I should have had this. I didn't look that closely at it, but the latter is what I'm looking for. 28:10. Here it is. Jacob 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went to Haran. Oh, yeah, sorry, not on there. I should have known that. He came to a certain place and stayed there for a night. Not like a motel, it was probably just a spot. And the sun had set, and taking one of the stones of the place, he put under his head and lay down on the place. And he dreamt that there was a stairway set upon the earth, and the top reaching to heaven. The angels of God were ascending and descending on it, which I always think is interesting that it mentions ascending before descending, because you think they have to go down to go back up, but it suggests that anyway. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. The land which you lie on, I give you and your offspring. So they were obviously in Israel or in Canaan at that time. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and the south, and all of the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and your offspring. Again, the call to be a blessing. Know that I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. And this is a part of that Adamic covenant. And then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And then he rose, and this is the image of the ladder. Now, what I love about this is just the and again, God's faithfulness, God speaking, God continuity of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Even though Jacob's kind of swarmy, God's still going to do something good through him. But the idea of the ladder. Now, obviously, this was not a real ladder. This was in a dream, so it's metaphorical. But I love the idea of ladder, and I love the idea of it being located to a place because it suggests that there is a portal between the earth and the heavenly realms, and that image of in exactly the way sci-fi captures it, of a spot on earth that you can go into another realm. And that, maybe angels all come in, maybe all the angels come in through this one portal. I don't know. I don't know how it works, but I love that idea because, again, it's God not cutting off connection. The angelic world, the celestial world has access, is a part of, is connected to. And you see the story unfold with God's faithfulness to Jacob and giving him ultimately 12 sons or 11 sons. And this brings us on to the next passage here, in which I do have.
Makes me think of a song
Yeah, the Stairway to Heaven.
as we sang as kids in church.
You mean Father Abraham? Or
No, we are climbing Jacob's ladder.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Say more.
To remember that, just
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that in years, probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool, the idea of that, hey, there's a connection, and maybe that's the place we're all going to be sucked up into into our ever after. It's going to be like a big vacuum. We think we're just going to materialize that, and who knows? Maybe that's when Christ went up. Maybe Christ was going up that ladder or that portal. I mean, maybe we thought he was ascending, but he was really running up those. He was ascending like this.
Yep.
I hope it's an easy ladder to get up.
Yeah.
I was gonna say,
Hope it's one of
don't
those
worry about
those
it. Right
electric
now,
ladders.
It's an elevator or something.
An escalator.
I know if God would have come back, if Christ would have come on the scene, in 2020, it would have been
Yeah.
the giant escalator. So the story. Jacob has all of these sons. Again, Jacob showing his less than great character, favors one of the sons. And then we get Genesis 37, and this one says 23 to 28. Now it says Genesis 37, this is 3 to 5, 18 to 19, and 23 and 28. So whatever, it's all about the same. Now Israel, and that was the name given to Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they only hated him more. And his brothers said, Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us? And one day they saw him afar off, and before he came near them, they conspired to kill him. And they said to one another, Here comes the dreamer. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and the Midianite traders passing by, and the brothers drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. Again, Ishmaelites, do you remember what that connection? That's the bastard child of Abraham. For 20 shekels of silver, and the Ishmaelites took Joseph to Egypt. Now, and we know what happens in the story. Joseph goes there, has dreams, rises up.
Yeah.
And then they ultimately, Joseph does. He reigns over them, and that prophecy comes to fulfillment. So what do you see in that? Where's God's faithfulness?
Well, he does not give up on Joseph.
No.
He allows Joseph to come back, and Joseph still loves his brothers and stuff.
Yeah. Well, you see the redemption. You see this great story of reconciliation.
Yeah.
And so that's great. You see, and obviously for Joseph to be able to do that, that's a pretty, and the challenge of the whole story of Joseph, though, and Job, is that it rewards the psychological pathway that says, as long as good comes on the other side of bad, it's okay.
It's okay, because the brothers were bad.
Yeah. And so, but that's, I think, a challenge of the story as a whole. Does anything else? God's faithfulness, reconciliation, as well. Maybe we see that it's really part two. Joseph usually has two stories, 45 through 31. Where is it? Oh, when he reveals, and as the story goes, they came and they wanted grain. He said, "How many brothers do you have?" And they said, "One stayed home with dad." And he said, "No, you need to bring him." So I think they were wanting, maybe he was wanting to see that the Benjamin wasn't also killed or something like that, because he was a child of old age. So they make him go back. They make them bring Benjamin back, and then he sends them back with as much grain, but he sticks a cup. And that's why in the symbol for the second part of Joseph, you have the cup as well. And the cup is really, I think, where we see is sort of the symbol of God's faithfulness, because it's set in a bag of grain. But and the story picks up and it says, and Pharaoh said to Joseph,
What does it represent?
the grain,
No, what does the cup represent?
that the cup was put in the bag of grain. So what happened was that the Joseph's now in a position of authority,
Right.
and the brothers, and there's a famine in the land, and so everyone around Egypt's like, what are we going to do? And so the brothers make their way to Egypt, and Jacob says, go, let's find some provisions. They get there, and he recognizes them, they don't recognize him. He says, they say, oh, there's an extra brother. He says, go get him. He wants to see they're all there for whatever reason, we don't know. They all come back. He says, okay, I'm going to send you. He sends them loaded up with grain, so they're going to survive. So this is God's provision for them. But he's tricking them. And in what he does is he sticks a silver cup into one of the bags. They didn't steal it, but then he sends his authority. It's such cop setup. I know.
It was a plan.
It's a frame.
And God approved. It's a God approved prank. God punked
The brothers, yeah, 10 other brothers.
but and so then God, and so he sends the authorities out, his guards out, and they say, no, we didn't steal, and they look in the bags and they pull this out, and it's a setup. So they bring him back, and really it is, honestly, Joseph could have revealed himself when they were there for the grain.
Right.
And it would have been a great moment of reconciliation. So this is the flavor of the text.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Joseph really screwing with them. He's like, you know what, I'm gonna,
Yes,
you're gonna
he
come
was.
back.
Oh, yes, he was.
They're all sweating on the way back. They all think they're gonna die. They think they're gonna get in trouble. They're, and then Joseph's like, it's just me. You got punked. It was the first punk. And then they reconcile, and then they don't even take the grain back. Because now he says, go get your father, go my father and bring him back. Now, this seems like, this is the seed of Abraham. The nation has not grown. I mean, yeah, there are some descendants, and yeah, there are a few in the mix, but the nation this is three human generations, not this big gap in the story like we see in other places. 3 human generations, and Joseph now is so they all go and they're reunited, and then you don't really have a lot of stories, but this is the basis of why Israel becomes enslaved. Because it says, while under Joseph's leadership during this time in Egypt, the Israelites grew in number and in strength, or something to that effect. And then you see Pharaoh feeling threatened by them. And then you see that turn after, I don't know how many years, 40, 60 years or something like that, I don't remember, but it turns into slavery. And then you have 400 years of slavery. And when you think about who Jews are, you don't even have all these practices are really not established. I mean, even some, there's nothing really into play. There's no law. There's no, and again, I've said this before, prior to the 10 Commandments, it was just free willy, man. You could do what you want. I love the Simpsons version of that when Moses is up on the top and he's, thou shalt not steal, right as Homer's taking a wallet from someone. He's like, oh, don't. Like, I was doing this all along, but now that, and so, which says all of those things that they put laws around, that God put laws around in the 10 Commandments, were part of the fabric, the moral fabric of that. But they didn't have the spirit. You're like, well, how could you murder? Well, someone's like, well, you took my, my hammer. Well, I'm going to, kill you, because there was no law against it.
Well, back then, laws like eye for an eye.
Yeah, that was more common.
Yeah, that was more common.
Yeah. Whenever Silas wants to get revenge on someone, because his nickname is Tutu, because he shares birthday with Desmond Tutu, but we call him OT Tutu. Because he's like, eye for an eye. You did this to me, I'm going to thwart you. Okay, so we're down to Joseph, the second Joseph, and then you jump into, after the 400 years of slavery, you get into Moses. And Moses is represented in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it is the story of, in this case, let my people go, is we used the whip, and it's the burning bush. In the story, it's Moses before God, and you see God's faithfulness of saying, "Now's the time. I'm going to deliver them." Sometimes it is a basket. In some places, I've seen it as a basket, but really the symbol or the character is Moses that you're trying to capture the whole Exodus story. So this gives us as and in fact, this one right here actually uses it as the Passover, and then it also gives you the Exodus 20, which is sometimes used in terms of the Ten Commandments. And God spoke these words, saying, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me," which I think is interesting because it always acknowledges that God actually is recognizing other gods, which goes back to the idea that Israel were not. It wasn't Judaism. They weren't Jews. It wasn't, I mean, they were Jews, but they didn't have a faith called Judaism. It was the Yahwehist faith, and it meant their God was better than the other gods. So you have that there. You shall not make yourself a graven image, meaning don't, idolatry. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And this is why the tetragram and, Yahweh, the Jews won't say it. And this is why anywhere you see the capital Lord, Lord in your Bible, of the Old Testament, Lord is the lesser replacement for the tetragram. Remember the Sabbath. That's huge to keep it holy. It's one we always ignore. We're like, yeah, whatever. Holy, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land which God gave you. I think there's something significant about that generational care. Honor your father and mother, and that's kind of like don't abandon them once pay honor to them and respect them. That's how traditions are passed down. You don't kill, you don't commit adultery, you don't steal, you don't bear false witness against your neighbor, you don't covet your neighbor's house, and you don't covet your neighbor's wife or his man or his maidservant or his ox or his ass or anything that is your neighbor's. And you're like, well, hey, it's just jealousy. Like, is it that big of a deal? But what you see in these is 4 commandments that deal with how God expects us to relate to God, and 6 commandments that relate to how we relate to others, which again, when you take those 2 in sum in the New Testament, you have Jesus saying, love God, verse 4, love your neighbor. So you say, how to love God? Well, don't put any other gods before them. Don't take his name in vain. Don't create graven images and idolatry. How do you love your neighbor? Respect them, even down to not just one, they say the difference between coveting and jealousy is you want what they have. Coveting is not wanting them to have it so you can have it. But this is the very notion of God. Now, and keep in mind, none of these things were around before this. So it's not as if like God just gave them, here's an extra spirit to be able to follow it. It was like, it was free, it was free living. And then all of a sudden there's like, what? We can't do all these things? Are you kidding me? So, imagine being an Israelite, but this is what God is saying. Now I'm going to begin to shape you. I'm going to begin to form you.
So when Abraham had relationships outside of his marriage, it wasn't really a bad thing then because it was before the commandments.
Well, and honestly, you jump ahead 1,000 years and you're in the time of David. David and Solomon had a lot of wives and a lot of concubines. There was it was a free, it was a swinging time, so to speak. But I'm saying that not in part in jest, but this is one of those things that anyone who says there is a single view of marriage in the Bible has not read their Bible.
Right.
I think that there is a unified expression of what God expects in marriage in the New Testament. That's an accurate statement. But marriage or sexual relation, again, adultery, when God said, thou shalt not commit adultery, that was not about a man having sex outside the relationship of marriage, which is what we project on it. That was about not having sex with another man's property.
And culturally, some of it was a public health
Yeah, I mean, you don't, let's
Well,
keep the
a lot of
STDs down.
Commandments actually had to do with public health.
Well, it's kind of like, yeah, you have all these concubines. Why are you going? The only reason you are is because you have dissonance between you and your brother, and it was very much, patriarchy then. So it was 100% through the. But women were viewed very much as property,
Right.
and this is why manservant, maidservants, like don't covet. Oh, they have more maidservants and manservants. Don't even covet the idea because it's. And again, all of those things go back to the relationship between at that time two men and not breaking and part of that is maybe just the evolution of humanity. We needed a long time to get to a place where now these again we look at it with a different mindset, and these days we're like, well, how could you think that would be okay? But adultery in this sense was not about sexual infidelity. It was about someone else's property. So which is important. That's why it's important we put these in our elementary schools, because we want those kids to know. That's just a joke.
Dang, I thought it was real.
So they establish themselves. So what you have is you have 40 years in the desert. They enter into the promised land in Joshua. They establish themselves with the Canaanites. They're still not faithful. They're still meeting up with other folks. And in that time, you have a period where you have the story of Ruth. And the reason Ruth is important is because Ruth actually starts the lineage. So the story of Ruth, and then usually represented by a stalk. Do I even have it here? Bronze serpent, no. Jonah.
Ruth 3.
Ruth 3. I don't. Oh, here it is. But Ruth said to Naomi, "Entreat me not to leave you or to return from following you. For where shall I go? Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. And your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Now, keep in mind, first of all, they're all genetically sort of similar from the same region, and there was a lot of intermingling. So anyone who says they're purely Jewish, there's really no such thing. Samaritans were Jews. In some regard, if it came from Abraham's seed, so in some regard were Ishmaelites, because they still came from Abraham. So that's why we call them the Abrahamic religions. But in this case, the Edomites or the Moabites, where they go, this is just Moab. So this is the southeastern portion of where we think of Israel today. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, and if you forget, they went over there to survive, and then her son married a Moabite. Their sons married Moabite women, so that's how you get the Moabites into the story. And Ruth and the Moabites said to Naomi, "Let me go to a field and glean upon the ears of grain." And this is after when they returned. So as after Ruth's husband died, Naomi decided to go back to Israel, and Ruth went with her and saying, "I'll be with you. Whatever you're doing, I'm doing." And they go back, and this is when Ruth and the Moabites said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears, just so they could eat ears of grain. After him whose sight I shall find favor." And she said, "Go to her." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." And then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go and glean in another field or leave this one. But keep close to my maidens." And what was going on was Naomi was trying to connect her kin with Ruth. And then, as the story goes, Ruth, she tells her to go lay on the feet of Boaz. And there are lots of discussion about what that really means, whether that's like a sexual, sort of giving of oneself. And again, at the time, that would have been completely fine. It would have been nothing weird about that. But it says, then she fell on her face and bowed on the ground. She said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice in me when I'm a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since your death of your husband has been fully told to me. Now you left your father and mother in your native land and came to the people that you did not know. The Lord recompense for you what you have done, and a full reward to be given to you by God under Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you this day, but without next of kin, that his name may be renowned in Israel." So now What we don't see here in this text is, and this is where and I love the way the story talks about their child they had's name was Obed, and Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. So you see, in this, this, I mean, I get tingles when I think about it. The faithfulness in this story. Anyone want? I mean,
Well, she's faithful to her mother-in-law, to her
Yes.
husband and her mother-in-law.
But how is God faithful? Where do we see God's faithfulness? That's what we're looking for.
Well, he gave them the vision and the idea to pass on down.
Well, and I would say you're right in terms of God's faithfulness to Naomi through Ruth and through Boaz. But where we in this and one of the other stories even before this is Rahab. Sometimes people use a red cord for Rahab, and I think Rahab's an interesting story because Rahab is listed in the genealogy in Matthew. Rahab was not a Jew. Rahab was a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabite, not a Jew. So now you have by virtue of Matthew's genealogy, you have a non-Jewish person within the lineage of Jesus. And a second one is Ruth. So where we see God's incredible faithfulness, and the reason I love the story is because what we see peppered in the story of God's redemptive history is not God not making it such an exclusive bloodline that others can't be engrafted into the story.
Jason,
Yeah. Yes, Glenda.
in my church here, our Advent messages are about those women that are in Matthew's genealogy. And that starts with Tamar,
Yes.
which is a real racy story.
Yeah.
It's a crazy story, but she was a Canaanite woman, I believe. And she was in that Matthew's genealogy. And then Rahab was a Canaanite woman, then Ruth. And then there's another one who's not mentioned by name. We haven't come to that one yet, but it's Uriah's wife, which is actually Bathsheba.
Yeah.
And she's also mentioned in Matthew's genealogy.
Yes.
So the whole theme, as you just said, that we often don't look at and isn't a popular theme in our country is that God loves outsiders.
Yes.
He is an inclusive God.
And you
And he
see it in the
brings
story of
in-
Jonah, you see it in other places, and I think that's important. I mean, you see it in I mean, you see it it's not everywhere, but it's peppered throughout. And what it does is it makes it in such a way that you can't just say it's a bloodline. That God has used outsiders, God has brought and blessed through these things. And at the same time, God says to Israel many times, don't intermingle. I mean, you see it in the story of Esther. You see it in the exile, there were all sorts of, and this is again the whole notion of the Samaritans were the ones who stayed and weren't exiled, and although they're probably ethnically Jewish or some combination of that, but you see God's majestic faithfulness in the sense of, and even in these stories, you see God prepping the world. This is foreshadowing for eventually the reconciliation of the world, not just the reconciliation of the Jews. And then the Jews become this sort of people group that do the very thing that Christ does, but it almost culminates in Christ, and it doesn't almost, it does culminate in Christ and who he was and the redemption of the world. Let's do one more, if that's okay, as I'm looking at my time.
Yeah.
And then we'll stop at David because then that's just a natural shift. And actually from David, it gets a little, it jumps around a bit. But the story of Samuel is often represented by an oil lamp. And it's during a time where you were shifting, if you remember, there were 12 tribes given, and there was a priestly tribe, but the priests didn't want to make all the moral governmental decisions, so God gave them judges. And this is where you get Samson and Deborah, and those are the only two that are coming off the top of my head. But those were the judges that sort of were there to guide the developing nation, the governmental side of it. Or the social side of it. And then, but Israel then said and then in between that, you have the beginning of prophets, you could say, that started with Samuel. And so Samuel is kind of that first prophet figure, although you could say Moses was also that prophet. But Samuel, in a more dedicated way, becomes this voice of God. And then this wasn't sufficient, but Samuel then becomes instrumental in both ushering in Saul. As you know, people are like, you know what, we don't want judges, we don't want prophets, we want a king like other nations. Again, going back to that Abraham thing, people grasping for the other nations, what they're doing. So God acquiesces, gives them Samuel, doesn't work out. And then as next week, we'll pick up with David. But before that happens, we have this role of Samuel as a prophet. And so we'll read that here when it says, and the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, seeing I've rejected him for being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for I have promised myself a king among his sons. And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David. And that sort of jumps ahead a little bit ahead of the story. But again, these are the stories that we're meant to go through because it reminds us of God's faithfulness of not just saying, hey, I'm going to let things unfold as they will, but I'm going to continue to guide this process. I have you priests for atonement. I'm giving you judges to guide you morally and to sort of keep the laws intact. And that's not working. Everyone else is a king. I'll give you a king. And then I'm going to give you the king that I want to give you. And in all these stories, I think one of those beautiful parts about them is it's always the little guy. It's always the most unsuspecting. I love that. The whole notion of a David and Goliath story is using the unsuspecting hero. And honestly, that just has impacted literature in so many ways. I mean, it's, think about anything, it's always about Harry Potter is the little guy who then becomes the big guy. And so, so we'll stop here and then we'll pick up David. And then from David, we'll go from about 1,000 years up to Christ. So we've covered up to this point up to about I always say that David is around 1,000. The chapters you see in those things on the ornaments are just the chapters. If you haven't printed out, take those home with you.
Okay.
And you can color them and hang them up, and if you can do the past ones. And honestly, even if you just pick it up tomorrow and start reading through, we'll go through the rest of them next week. But go through and allow these stories to say, hey, how do they connect? And that's what's great about a book like Geraldine McCullen's book is that it gives it a narrative and ties all the stories together. But I think every Christian should know these stories. Mm-hmm. Every Christian should know these stories. Every Christian should be able to tell these stories. And maybe we are in the place we are spiritually in this nation is because we have stopped telling the very stories that demonstrate God's faithfulness to humanity, to Israel, and the majesty of our inclusion in that redemption.
Yep.
Take these, read the stories. We'll pick it up next week with David, and that ends us for this time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Email next week. Jim, I'll give you a call on my walk tonight and wish you a happy birthday in my own special way. I don't even know what that means, but it sounded good though. Good night.
Good night.
You